Hey, thanks for checking out my video. Today we're going to do a quick summary, a 10-minute book brief, if you will, of Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking by Susan Cain. In roughly 10 minutes, we will provide you a summary of the three big ideas that are being presented to the world in this book, an outline of the chapters that are in this book, and there are 11 of them, and also offer you some of the great quotes, some of my favorite quotes that I identified throughout the book. So the first big idea that's presented to the world in Quiet is that introversion is a valuable and misunderstood trait. Cain challenges the societal norms that seem to put a higher value on extroverted or extroversion-related traits. And she stresses the important contributions that introverts have made to society and the role that we introverts can play in the world. Next, she does foster this idea that it's really important for both introverts and extroverts to have periods of solitude and quietness, or as she called it, quietude. The book emphasizes the significance of solitude for introverts by fostering creativity, reflection, and personal growth. And she discusses ways in which the world can be more inclusive just by virtue of allowing space for introverts to thrive by offering periods of solitude, quietude, and showing value for individual work. And then finally, leading into that same last thought, she presents a pretty detailed summary of how creating environments that honor introversion could really make a difference. Cain advocates for creating environments, whether in schools, workplaces, or communities, that recognize and accommodate the needs and preferences of introverts. And that's really important, I think, in today's world. Those sorts of opportunities are ignored and sometimes even ridiculed because we put so much of an emphasis in our society, particularly in Western culture, on loud, excitement and group-based activities that are intended to foster good teamwork and create positive energy, but quite often internally, even if they don't allow anybody to see it, will create a negative effect, a strong negative effect on introverts, particularly those that are way over toward the highly introverted end of the spectrum. So in chapter 1, Cain talks about the rise of the extrovert ideal and gives us a little bit of a history lesson. And this chapter is chock full of insights, including insights that are provided by some of the kind of classic social science-based realizations that emerged through the studies of Carl Jung. And it's just kind of an interesting trip down the history of the development of understandings of personality types. And she also alludes to multiple times how, as a society, we've come to covet the extrovert or the extroverted type personality. In chapter 2, she walks us through some of the myths of charismatic leadership, really speaking to the notion that effective leadership has to be accomplished through the use of loud, boisterous, outwardly braggadocious, charismatic leadership. And in many cases that will be true, but there are circumstances where introverts bringing their unique perspectives and their unique ability to stay with problems longer, and also their heightened observation skills and empathy will give them the tools they need to succeed in certain situations where more extroverted personality types might struggle. In chapter 3, we talk about how these environments that are insisted upon in some venues where there's required collaboration all the time and no room for personal contribution or introspection or reflection can really kill creativity. And she gives pretty good scientific examples of that, along with some pretty good anecdotes and stories, as is the case throughout the whole book. In chapter 4, she goes through the new groupthink and discusses, how in the previous chapter, she kind of builds on the previous chapter and discusses how we can delve deeper into the cultural biases toward group work and consistent collaboration. And she argues that solitude and independent work is essential for deep thought and reflection and creative breakthroughs. It's kind of interesting to see her expand on this whole thought process and really build the scientific justification for the need for good deeper work that introverts typically are just a little bit better at. In chapter 5, she goes into a little bit of a biology lesson where she talks about the biology of leadership. And she examines the neurological difference between introverts and extroverts and highlights how extroverts process information differently than introverts. And she discusses the role of neurotransmitters such as dopamine and other chemicals in the brain that help shape personality traits. And then in chapter 6, she asks the question about whether or not all cultures really operate in the same way, and as far as how they value those on the introvert-extrovert spectrum. And she shares some interesting kind of insights. By and large, extroversion is something that's valued highly in all cultures, but particularly Western culture. And she explores cultural differences and the valuation of the introversion and extroversion, personality traits, and discusses how cultural norms and expectations shape the personality traits and behaviors themselves within children that are growing up in society. Chapter 7, very useful chapter. She talks about how to love and how to work, and kind of goes through some ideas and as far as how introverts can set themselves up for success in society, and in addition to that, how people can care for them and make sure they have opportunities to thrive. And in chapter 8 rather, I love this title, on cobblers and generals and how culture shapes who we are. She kind of expands on some of the ideas once again in the previous chapter, and she explores the influence of cultural factors on individual personality traits, particularly introversion and extroversion. She discusses the concept of cultural character versus culture of personality, and how social expectations play into all this. So moving into chapter 9. The soft power, Asian Americans, and the extrovert ideal. She builds on the previous 2 chapters, and she focuses on the experience of Asian Americans navigating the extrovert ideal, because she kind of builds the foundation for this in previous chapters, where she describes how many of the Eastern cultures tend to have more of an equal weighting in value for the introvert and extrovert ideals, and actually introversion itself, may even have higher valuation in Eastern cultures, many Eastern cultures. In chapter 10, the communication gap and how to talk to members of the opposite type. This is really important because, not only do introverts and extroverts look at the world differently, generate energy, and recover differently, but oftentimes they use very different language. Introverts will tend to take a little bit of a circuitous route when making a point. They may tend to be more cautious in their language and their speech because they want to be a little bit more accurate, and they also want to be very conscious of the potential impact on the other person that they're speaking to, whereas extroverts tend to be a little bit more direct, less precise. May have shoot, aim, fire kind of mentality, and those sorts of differences can create some challenges with communication and relational aspects, going on between the two types. So, really helpful chapter. And then finally, in chapter 11, when we get to the end of the book, on cobblers and generals and the prescription for raising Cain, there's some really good ideas here related to child development. And in addition to that, the potential, some of the assumptions related to the potential of folks and their abilities to achieve and contribute in society, and kind of helps understand that there might be some limitations for extreme introverts and as far as what types of roles they'll succeed in and find happiness with. But at the same time, the same applies to extroverts, and we're all in the same boat. We all kind of have to find our way, and find the best possible world for us. And it's kind of part of the bigger adventure that we experience making our way here in this world. And then some of my favorite quotes include, actually, most of my favorite quotes are quotes that she references of other individuals, like this one, where she explained that in 1921, Carl Jung noted that the newly precarious status of introversion. Jung saw introverts as educators and promoters of culture who showed value in the interior life, which is so painfully wanting in our civilization. But he acknowledged that their reserve and apparently groundless embarrassment naturally arouse the current prejudice against this type. So obviously, in a brief statement, Jung was expressing some of the challenges and advantages associated with the different personality types here relative to the culture that was emerging or had been emerging for quite some time already, as early as 1921. Next one is, "It's not that I am so smart," said Einstein, who was a consummate introvert. "It's that I stay with problems longer." So, I think that's one of those little encouraging quotes for us introverts. Mark Twain once told a story about a man who scoured the planet looking for the greatest general who had ever lived. When the man was informed that the person he saw had already died and gone to heaven, he made a trip to the pearly gates to look for him. St. Peter pointed at a regular-looking Joe. "That isn't the greatest of all generals," protested the man. "I knew that person when he lived on earth, and he was only a cobbler." "I know that," said St. Peter, "but if he had been a general, he would have been the greatest of them all." A lot there in that little quote, and I don't know, it's just a funny story. It's always good to get a Mark Twain quote mixed in. And then last few, "A man has many social selves. There are distinct groups of persons about whose opinion he cares. He generally shows a different side of himself to each of these groups." And that's William James quote referenced in chapter 9. When should you act more extroverted than you really are? And that's an important concept for introverts to really get. Not always easy to do. In other words, introverts are capable of acting like extroverts for the sake of work they consider important, people they love, or anything they value highly. That's another quote from the book referencing the studies, in this case, of Harvard professor Brian Little. And then we have another quote from Brian Little. According to Little, "Our lives are dramatically enhanced when we're involved in core personal projects that we consider meaningful, manageable, and not unduly stressful, and that are supported by others." So once again, it's a quote from the book. where Cain references the studies of Harvard professor Brian Little. So went a little longer this time, but there is a lot of content here, and I appreciate you checking out my video. I would encourage you to check out Quiet. It is a really interesting book if you have introverts in your life that sometimes are a little bit of an enigma, hard to understand, find confusing, or if you're not sure where you fall on the introvert extrovert spectrum, or if you know you're an introvert and you just like to gain some insight that might help you better understand the world and the ways with which you can impact the world and operate within the world that kind of honor who you are, could be a really helpful book. Thanks for checking out my video, and we'll hope to get another quick book brief in within the next couple months. I'm going to get back to painting and learning, and don't forget to check out some of my other videos on my channel. Take care.